Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here, once again with a Let's Talk segment, here to finish off the DK class with its final class tree, Ardent Flame. After I complete this video, I will be giving a broad overview of how the class fits into both PvE and PvP in terms of meta, DPS, tanking, and healing. Let's get right off into our active abilities with Ardent Flame. Probably one of the most powerful and complete class lines. There's a reason why I left it for last. Let's start off first with Lava Whip. It's now the first ability you get while leveling. This is a great change. Actually, before, the first thing you got was Fiery Grip, which was an awful skill to give to players at level 1 because all it did was act as a utility sort by pulling things. Now you actually get a really cool centerpiece of the DK class, which is Whip. It's a Magicka ability. It's a melee range, although it is 8 meters range. The 8 meter range is quite forgiving in terms of positioning, so you don't actually have to be up right in the face of an enemy to use it. It scales off of max Magicka, spell damage, spell critical, and spell penetration. And since it deals flame damage, it will be benefited by Elemental Expert in the champion point system. It's a pretty straightforward ability. It costs a decent chunk of max Magicka. The tooltip you see here is not accurate, as I am a stamina build, so I don't have cost reduction, but still, it's pretty in line with most other spammables. It's a little bit higher because it's a quite powerful ability. Simply what happens is it's an instant cast. Whenever you hit it, you do flame damage up front, and then if you hit an enemy that is currently immobilized or stunned, it will set them off balance. Now, what off balance does is it opens up a lot of interesting things in terms of internal calculations as well as interesting exploitable mechanics. And by exploitable, I don't mean like game breaking, cheating, or anything like that. I mean something that you can interact and use to your advantage. So you've probably seen something like hold right click to exploit. This is what happens when you target or are looking at a off-balance target. And what happens is if you get a fully charged heavy attack, or even just hold down the heavy attack button for 0.1 second and it's considered a heavy attack, you will knock the target down and deal additional damage. The other really big benefit of setting a target off balance comes from the ritual tree in CP called Exploiter, which increases your damage against off-balance enemies by 10%. For Magicka DKs, since Whip is a Magicka-based ability and there are no stamina morphs, they don't really have access to this right now, but in the future, they will be able to get this. And likely next patch, when we have so much CP that they're able to pump up Thaumaturge in PvE, they'll be able to gain this passive as well. Two morphs we have for Lava Whip are Molten Whip, which simply increases our weapon and spell damage for other Ardent Flame abilities while it's slotted on that bar. So what you have to do is you have to have Molten Whip on that bar, and then any Ardent Flame damage you're currently dealing, it doesn't even have to be on your bar, will get an extra scaling mechanism. So it's about 300 spell damage if I recall, maybe 250 or so. It does not scale with percent amplifications. It is a flat gain that applies to the coefficient of each and every skill. But it's quite potent. It adds about 300 DPS per ability in full raid situations with critting and all that added to it. So it can add up to about 1200 to 1500 DPS for Magicka DK builds in PvE endgame raiding, so it's quite powerful. But the really awesome thing about this skill is, let's say I have Whip on my main bar, and then I have Ardent Flame abilities like Engulfing Flame or Flames of Oblivion on the back bar, and I cast them, and then I swap. Now, since Engulfing Flame is a dot, or Noxious Breath is a dot, the dot damage will continue after I swap off of my bar and will continue to deal damage. And now that I have Lava or Molten Whip on this bar, or if I did, for sake of examples, it would also gain that extra scaling to it, as well as my Flames of Oblivion. The same goes with Standard of Might or any other dot. So Venomous Claw and Unstable Flame. Noxious Breath and Engulfing Flames, both morphs, well, only Flames of Oblivion because the other one's a heal, and then both morphs of Might they'll all get that extra scaling if you have Molten Whip on your current bar that you're dealing damage with, even if you didn't drop those abilities on. So it's kind of confusing at first, but it's really straightforward. Just anytime you're dealing damage with Ardent Flame abilities, if Molten Whip is on that bar, you'll gain some nice extra damage to it. Pretty straightforward. The other morph for it is called Flame Lash, which is really interesting because whenever you set an enemy off balance, remember that we have to hit a target that's immobilized or stunned in order to set them off balance. But when we do set them off balance, ability converts into something called Flame Lash or Power Whip, I believe is the secondary, which activates a much more powerful version of the ability for free. So it deals more damage, and then it heals you over 2 seconds after activating it. This is a really strong morph in PvP and in some PvE situations if you're soloing or doing VMA where you need some healing, but it really helps the DK put down the hurt and then gain free casts, so helping with resource management as well as getting some much needed healing for the DK class. Overall, very unique ability. It feels awesome to use. It's great. Next ability we have is called Searing Strike. It is a damage over time ability. It is a range of 5 meters, so you have to be pretty close to apply it. It deals initial damage and then does a dot over 9 seconds. I believe actually the base is 8.5 at rank 1, but then increases to 9. But it only deals damage every 2 seconds. So that extra 1 second is kind of redundant until we get a passive later on. Pretty straightforward. Searing Strike scales off of Max Magicka, spell damage, spell critical, and spell penetration. The two morphs we have are Venomous Claw, which converts it into a stamina ability, meaning it scales off max stamina, weapon damage, weapon critical, and armor penetration, because it will deal poison damage instead. The other added benefit of this morph is that every tick of damage, or every 2 seconds, the dot will increase its damage by 12%. So the longer this stays up, the more damage it's dealing. Meaning it's really important to let this get the full 10-second duration. It has a 10.5-second duration with our passive, but since it deals damage in 2-second intervals, that 0.5 seconds is wasted. So ideally what you want to do is right after 10 seconds, so at 10.01, obviously you can't do that if you're a human being, but after 10 seconds you want to reapply this so that you're continuing to do damage, and the scaling mechanism is allowed to refresh and then ramp up once again. The other morph we have is called Burning Embers, which retains the caster oriented, so it scales off max magicka, spell damage, spell critical, spell penetration, all that good stuff. This morph heals for X% of damage done when the effect ends. The reason why I say X% is because it scales off of a lot of different things and will increase based on percent healing, passives, and the rank of the ability. I believe at rank 4 with no healing passives, it heals for 68% of the damage done once the effect ends. Now what that means is if you let the full 10.5 second duration go off, after that you'll get a really big heal, healing for 64%, 68% based on what level of the damage that it had dealt. That means if you're critting a lot or just have really big stats and are doing a lot of damage with it, you're going to get a massive heal. We're talking well over our maximum HP pool. The other awesome thing about this is that you can recast it to get the heal sooner. Granted, you'll get less healing because it will have had less time to deal damage, so the percent of the damage dealt won't be as high. So let's say if you let it last 10.5 seconds and it deals 20k, you're going to get that 64% of the 20k. But if you recast it after 4 seconds and it only does 5k, then you're only going to get the 64% of the 5k instead. But it still allows DKs to get an on-demand sort of heal, and it's still very potent even if it hasn't done too much damage because of percent scaling. It can crit. It's just a really strong morph in terms of survivability. Next ability we have is called Fiery Breath, which is a conal AoE that goes in front of you, just as any other conal, and deals fire damage. It has a 10-meter radius in terms of how far it goes, but it operates like a conal, so it's very thin at the start point, and then it grows in size at the end. So I'll cast one morph to demonstrate. Notice how it's thinner near where I cast it, and then it grows in size as it goes out. That goes out for 10 meters, and anything hit by it will have this dot applied to it. The base morph is just initial damage and then a 9-second dot. Fiery Breath scales off of max magicka, spell damage, spell penetration, and spell critical. And since it deals fire damage, it will use the elemental expert passive. Pretty much anytime something deals fire, ice, or lightning, it'll do elemental expert, and then if it deals physical, poison, or disease, it'll use mighty. So keep that in mind when you're building your CP for your characters. Two morphs we have are called Noxious Breath, which converts this into a stamina ability, so it'll deal poison damage, meaning it'll scale off of stamina, weapon damage, weapon critical, and armor penetration. What this morph does is obviously converts it, and then it also adds major fracture to any enemy hit within it. This is a great morph because it gives the DK some more armor shredding innate to their class that really helps them out in solo play and in PvP by mitigating resistances, because without it they would be dealing less damage. The other really nice thing about this is that it's a conal and it can apply to multiple targets. So other classes like a tank using Pierce or a Nightblade using Surprise Attack, if they're fighting a large amount of enemies, in order to get major fracture on everything, they have to go around and hit each and every target and then refresh it. While as the DK only has to line everything up in front of them and then do one button and boom, they're all taking damage over time and then they're getting major fracture as well. So this is really great for helping out group DPS in terms of dungeons and in trials and even in PvP. The other morph we have is called Engulfing Flames, which retains the max magicka scaling, so it's still caster based and deals fire damage, but the added benefit of this is that any target afflicted with Engulfing Flames takes 10% more fire damage. Now, this is awesome for the DK, especially for the caster DK, because everything they do is fire damage. Unless you're talking about special procs from abilities or sets, or using a lightning staff, but over 90% of their damage dealt, even with some of these other builds, is fire damage. So that's meaning it's getting 9% raw DPS in terms of our overall contribution, which is extremely potent. The other really nice thing about this is that anyone dealing fire damage gets this benefit. So let's say I'm a Stamina Nightblade and I drop a shooting star on a mob. If Engulfing Flames has been applied, my shooting star, even though I'm not a DK and I didn't apply Engulfing Flames, my shooting star, since it deals fire damage, will gain a 10% damage increase. So it really helps out group DPS because a lot of builds use Meteor, they use Destruction Staves, which are Inferno Staves, there are DKs in the group, and there's a lot of other sources of flame damage in the game, so this 10% actually goes a really long way, making it very important to keep up in group PvE content. Our next ability we have is called Fiery Grip, which is a utility ability. What it does is it simply deals flame damage when you cast it on an enemy, and then it pulls that enemy to you if they are not immune to CC. If they are immune to CC, they'll just stand there and you'll stand at your position from where you casted it and nothing will happen. It costs a lot of magicka. Again, tooltip is not reflective of what it would cost on, say, a tank or a caster. I have no cost reduction in max magicka, so that's the pure baseline cost. But it's still pretty hefty. It's not meant to be spammed. But it also grants us major expedition, increasing our movement speed by 30% for 2 seconds. Unfortunately, 2 seconds isn't a very long time window. It's mainly there for PvP because DKs have a very hard time moving around. They're very immobile, so they can't move around a lot. They're very stationary, kind of like Templars. So this was kind of an answer to give them an option in terms of sticking to their targets or moving around, but I think it should last a little bit longer. But anyways, the two morphs we have are called Empowering Change, which reworks how chains work. So instead of an enemy coming to you, you go to it. And the great thing about this is even if it's immune to CC, you will always pull yourself to this mob. So if a player uses an immovability potion or a boss which are immune to CC is running away, you can use this ability and then get right back in melee range, so you can use Pierce or start DPSing again, although I would not suggest this on most DPS builds outside of key encounters in PvP and maybe a few PvE fights. But the other nice thing about this is that it grants you Empower, giving you a 20% damage bonus on your next direct damage attack. So what I mean by direct damage is it has to be an instant cast ability, and it can't deal damage over time. So things like Noxious Breath, since it deals initial damage, that initial damage at the start would get the 20%, but the dot damage would not. Other things like you can empower Meteors since they deal initial damage, but you can empower things like Soul Strike or Jesus Beam or other stuff that's channeled or deals damage over time. So it's not a very great ability. It's not meant to be weaved to get you empowers all the time, but it's a little added benefit. So this is more of a PvP morph. It helps tanks stick to their targets, and then kind of deal with engaging in fights and stuff. The other morph, on the other hand, is called Unrelenting Grip, which makes it so it still operates the same way, where it attempts to pull enemies to you. However, if the enemy is immune to CC or has CC immunity for the time being, which is an 8-second window, it will refund the cost and then nothing will happen. So instead of draining your magicka and being this deficit of resources, you'll actually get the refund. And since it deals damage, you can actually spam this over and over again as, say, a tank or a magicka DPS where you're trying to get a hold of a mob. Say the ad phase of Veteran Mauve Lorcage, there are ads during the twin fight that you have DKs chained to them, but sometimes they become immune to CC and you have to sit there and chain over and over again, and if without this morph you'd run out of magicka. But luckily this refunds it every time that they can't be pulled, so you're able to just wait and spam it so that the second they become CCable, you're pulling them immediately. It also helps in PvP a little bit if you're trying to pull targets to you and they're immune to CC. You can kind of just keep doing it over and over again until they finally are no longer immune. Our last active ability we have is called Inferno. Inferno is a self-buff which lasts 15 seconds and has a 15-meter radius. What it is you activate it and a buff happens where you deal flame damage to one nearby target. So any target nearby you, it'll hit. I'm not sure how it decides targeting. I think it's which target you are currently attacking, but I mean, it's Zos. I could be wrong. There could be very weird instances where it deals with. I don't use the ability too much, so I'm not 100% sure. Still, it deals damage every 5 seconds, and since it lasts 15, that means it only deals 3 sources of damage per cast. Meaning it's not really good for shorter fights because it deals with sustained damage in 5 second intervals instead of burst where it's like every 2 or every 1. So if you're gonna keep this up, which is usually done on your back bar, you cast it every 15 to 20 seconds and then you get some extra damage from it. But it's still really not an insanely powerful dot. I would like to see it last a little bit longer or deal damage in faster increments, but deal overall less damage per hit. Anyways, since it deals fire damage, it scales off of max magicka, spell damage, spell penetration, and spell critical. However, stamina builds can use this, but not in its base morph form. I'm going to get into the morphs now, which one is called Cauterize, which reworks the damage into a heal. So instead of, whenever you activate it, instead of damaging nearby enemies, you heal nearby allies. It's still pretty weak overall. It was kind of given as an option for the DK healing route, which has been getting slow but steady buffs over the course of the game. ZeniMax is really trying to make it an option to do other things other than Templars, but it
it doesn't give any utility. It's rather weak. It doesn't have smart targeting. Um, so it's kind of lackluster. It's a fun ability to use, but overall it's a little bit meh. Um, the other morph we have is called Flames of Oblivion, which adds another thing to it, which I should remedy, that each of these morphs, Inferno, Cauterize, and Flames of Oblivion, they also give Major Prophecy passively for having it slotted, which increases your spell critical by 10% exactly. So this is a pretty nice morph for casters, as it's an indefinite source, so you don't need potions. However, Flames of Oblivion also makes it give Major Savagery and then allows it to scale off of your max stats. It'll deal flame damage no matter what, so if you're a stamina build, it won't magically become poison, unfortunately, so it's not getting the full benefit from our CP, but it'll still scale off of your max stamina if it's the highest, and then weapon damage, weapon critical, and armor penetration. Um, Although I'm seeing conflicting results with the armor penetration versus spell penetration thing. It deals flame damage, which internally means that no matter what it's scaling off of, it should deal spell, or it should use spell penetration. However, I haven't been able to determine it because it changes its damage numbers so quickly based on other increases. So I'll get back to that one. Um, Overall, Flames of Oblivion is a great ability to have on your back bar if you have room for it. It deals decent damage over time, equating to roughly 1.8 to 2.5k single target DPS in a long term fight in full raid buffs. It can do more if you're using it more, but since it's not super strong like Venomous Claw or Unstable Flame or something like that, it's not as high priority to manage. And the other bad thing about it is if you bar Major Prophecy or Savagery on one bar but not the other, anytime you swap off of that bar, you will lose any other buff. So to make that more clear, let's say I drink a weapon power potion that gives me 10% critical, and I do not have Major Savagery on this bar. So Flames of Oblivion is not on my bar. I'll gain that 10% weapon critical, and then I'll swap to my bar where Flames of Oblivion is, and since it gives me Major Savagery, I'm still going to have that 10% critical. However, how this game's buff system works is any buff or debuff that has a longer duration will refresh and override. So since this is an indefinite source of Major Savagery versus a 40-second window from the 150 potions, this will take precedence and will remove the Major Savagery from our potions. So if I swap back, I have now lost 10% crit. The same happens with spell critical. It's very long bug. It's why I really don't like using Flames of Oblivion as a stamina DPS, because I don't double bar Major Savagery. I don't have room for it in most of the content I do. You can run it on both bars, or you can run Evil Hunter or something like that to gain it as well, but I don't like doing that. I think there are other better abilities to do. But casters don't have to worry about it because they have Inner Light, which gives them Max Magicka and Major Savagery, or Major Prophecy, so casters don't have this happen to them as much, but it still affects a lot of players. It's very annoying. It's been reported numerous times, so hopefully one day it gets fixed and that this skill isn't seen as more of a loss, but actually as an option. Anyways, going on to our ultimate. By far, the strongest ultimate in the game. It's awesome, it looks cool, it's super high damage, and it has a lot of utility. The base morph, not so much. The base morph is called Dragonite Standard. It costs 250 ultimate, which is extremely high cost. It is the highest cost ultimate in the game, aside the Destruction Staff ultimate, which has the same ultimate cost, but still very, very high cost. It's meant to be used in clutch situations or for high damage. But what it does is it deals flame damage over time, which is 15 seconds is the base morph, in an 8-meter radius. And then it also applies Major Defile to anything in it. So this is relatively strong. The flame damage is nice. Since it's an ultimate, it scales off of whatever stats are highest, so it doesn't matter. However, since it deals flame damage, it will always use spell penetration, even as a stamina build, which is unfortunate, but thanks to a lot of armor shredding or spell resistance shredding in endgame trials, this isn't too much of an issue. The morphs is where this ultimate becomes really interesting. So the first morph is called Shifting Standard, which reduces the cost to 200 from 250. It still deals flame damage, it still applies Major Defile, and it still has the same parameters, so 8 meters, scales off of whatever stats are highest, etc. The really cool thing about this, other than it costing 50 less ultimate, is that you can recast it at a new position, refreshing the duration. So the optimal way to use this skill is you let it last the 15 seconds at rank 1. It lasts 17, I believe, at rank 2, or yeah, 17 at max rank with a passive. So you let it tick for 14 seconds, and then on the final second, you quickly recast and get another 14 seconds. You can get it to last 15 if you are extremely quick and have very good reaction time, but this is really hard to do, so I usually suggest the 12 to 14 second window to reactivate it. This is a really strong morph for PvP as it applies Major Defile to large groups, and it allows you to snare enemies thanks to a passive that I'll get to in a bit, dealing continuous damage, and then kind of control the battlefield by scorching the ground with damage that enemies want to move out of. They'll start dodge rolling, etc. The other nice thing is that each morph of this ability and the base morph also has something called Shackle, which is a synergy which allies can activate. It scales off of max health, and it deals flame damage, and then it will immobilize them. So it's not a snare, it's an immobilize, so they'll get like rooted for a little bit. But so yeah, this is a really nice morph in PvP because each time you recast it, it also refreshes the synergy. So even if you just hit the synergy, someone else can come up and activate it again if you recast Shifting Standard. So on the first one, it'll give one synergy. If an ally uses it, it'll be consumed. And then if you recast it, a new one will appear. The other morph we have is called Standard of Might, which is the ultimate of this game. The ultimate. The most overpowered ultimate. It's why, or pretty much why, ZeniMax removed Dynamic Ultimate Generation, because it's so strong. What it does is it also increases your damage dealt by 20% while standing in it, and reduces damage you take by 20% while standing in it. This is extremely potent, as no other ultimate in the game gives 20% damage increased for this long. The only other ultimate in this game that gives us 20% damage is Soul Harvest, which lasts 6 seconds. This lasts 17. The other thing is Soul Harvest only increases damage that you deal to the target you hit it with, while Standard of Might increases any damage you deal to any target. You could drop Standard of Might and hit a target 20 meters away, and as long as you're standing in Standard, you'll get that 20% damage boost. So this is why DKs have been the #1 DPS class as Stamina, as Magicka, as whatever for the game's conception. Ever since Standard of Might was made a thing, Stamina and Magicka DKs have been #1 in every patch. It was one or the other. Right now, Stamina DK is the overall highest single target DPS. Magicka DK is at a very close third or second, and they can contend very well in AoE as well. I've seen Mag and Stam DKs pull well over 50k on hard mode Rakat. They are very capable of damage. They do great in terms of AoE and single target, but it's mainly because Standard of Might. You use no other ultimate as a DK other than maybe Elemental Rage in very niche application. But the 20% damage from Standard is like why DKs have been so hard to balance. in PvP. Before, when there was dynamic ultimate generation, you could put 3, 4, 5 of these down if you were lucky enough and hitting enough targets, and every time you dropped it, that 20% damage would stack, and the mitigation would stack. That's why dynamic ulti-gen was thrown out the window, because Standard of Might was the most powerful ultimate. It's why when you look at old PvP videos of DKs, they were beasts, and now they've been like toned down to a really iffy state. Yeah, you can still kick ass on a Maj DK or Stam DK in PvP, but it's a lot harder and it requires a lot more mechanical and technical knowledge and skill from the player, while before it was just like, okay, you got a Standard of Might, place it down, melt everyone. Honestly, I would really like to see Standard of Might get its power distributed elsewhere. I think it's way too strong. It makes it so DKs don't have options for other ultimates because you're giving up so much by this. And the other thing is no other class has something. Yes, it's selfish in terms of it only decreases damage you receive, but it's why there's such a big damage discrepancy between other classes. And even though DKs don't have an execute, they manage to be number 1 or number 2 every patch, and it's because Standard of Might. And I would really like to see the skill be redistributed elsewhere in the kit so that DKs can retain their strength but require more in order to do so. I think Standard of Might is just way too overloaded. Major Defile, 20% damage increase, 20% damage decrease received, a very potent flame damage dot, AoE, strong duration, has a synergy. It just has so much. So, Standard of Might, yeah, I would like to see some redistribution of power with this ultimate, but still, it is by far the most badass, the most powerful ultimate in the game. Now, we'll move on to our passives. Our first passive is called Combustion, which increases the damage dealt by burning and poison status by 33 and 66% respectively. 33% rank 1, 66% rank 2. This is a pretty straightforward passive. It just increases the damage from the secondary effect when dealing fire or poison damage. So every element in the game has a chance to proc an additional effect. Fire is called Burning, which applies a medium damage dot over time, which deals flame damage for about 6 seconds. And then Poisoned, also when dealing damage, it has a chance to reduce health recovery on the mob and deals a medium dot over 9 seconds. So Burning is stronger overall in terms of raw DPS, but Poisoned lasts longer and then also reduces health recovery on mobs or players. So this is pretty nice. It makes it 66%. The other really cool thing about this passive is that the new item set, or excuse me, the revamped item set, Burning Spellweave, which applies burning, the burning passive from Burning Spellweave gets the 66% bonus for Magicka DKs, and it's why Burning Spellweave is so awesome on Maj DKs, because it's gating so much extra free DPS on top of the fact that everything that DKs do is fire damage, so it's up a lot. So really cool passive in terms of overall interaction with the kit on top of synergizing with their current best in slot as the Maj DK. Our next passive is called Warmth, and what it does is anytime you deal damage with an Ardent Flame ability, you reduce the movement speed of the enemy hit by 30% for 2 and 4 seconds respectively. 2 at rank 1, 4 at rank 2. This is also why Standard of Might is so strong, is because this deals Ardent Flame damage. It's an Ardent Flame ability. So on top of everything that I stated about what's so strong about Standard of Might, it also snares for 30% move speed, meaning that enemies have a really hard time moving out of it when you stack in other things like immobilizations, other snares which stack, and then or that they have to spam dodge roll to get out of it. So it's really strong. It's a great morph. It works on anything, anytime you deal damage with Whip and its morphs, Searing Strike in its morphs, Fiery Breaths in its morphs, literally anything in this class tree other than Cauterize, since it doesn't deal damage, will apply Warmth to a mob. And it's not game changing, but it's still very potent. It helps stick to enemies, it helps kite enemies. Very solid passive. Next passive we have is called Searing Heat, which increases the duration of Fiery Breath, Searing Strike, and Dragonite standard abilities by 2 seconds at rank 1, and then rank 2 also increases the damage of these abilities by 3%. This also applies to the morphs. It's pretty straightforward. Its Y standard lasts 17 instead of 15, Claw lasts 10 instead of 8, Noxious is 10 instead of 8, so it adds some extra damage in terms of overall sticking power. So 3% extra damage and then 2 seconds additional duration gives an additional 2 ticks on standard and then 1 on Claw and Noxious Breath. And its morphs, obviously. The last passive we have is called World in Ruin, which increases the damage of any flame and poison area of effect ability by 3% and 6% respectively. The really cool thing about this passive is that it isn't exclusive to DK only abilities. It means anything that deals flame or poison damage in an area effect gets it. So it encompasses weapon abilities such as our ultimate, Wall of Elements, etc. It affects the bow in terms of acid spray. There is just a lot of other things that it encompasses, and it also affects item sets as well. So Valken Scoria has an AoE component, so it gets that 6% extra AoE damage. Follows the heavy attack Undaunted set that deals poison damage, that also gets 6% additional damage. And it's why DKs are able to use a large variety of sets and see much more gain out of them than other classes, is because this passive increases the operational value of these sets and abilities. But yeah, that's it for the Ardent Flame class. There's a lot to digest and there's a lot to consider in terms of balance, and like just looking at the Ardent Flame class and not looking at Earthen Heart or Draconic Power, you can see how much raw power is in the DK's hands and why it feels like such a fleshed out class. Yes, it could use some attention in PvP in terms of solo play, but in terms of PvE, it has been the king since this game came out, and it continues to dominate to this day, regardless of Magicka or Stamina. They also make the most favored tanks of the game. Are they the best tanks? That's situational. That's opinion-based. I find Nightblade tanks to be extremely competitive with Dragonite tanks, but the overall class purpose, the richness of it, the enjoyability you can derive in terms of just feeling like this massive badass with pulling enemies in, being really tanky, locking enemies down with immobilization, and just having a very well thought out and goal-oriented kit in terms of it. It wants to do something. It has an idea, it has a goal, and then it does it. And the Nightblade class kit and some of the other class kits don't have that as well fleshed out. Sure, their other classes have good kits and have good abilities in them, but none of them to the extent that the Dragonite has. There are very few quote-unquote junk abilities that a Dragonite has. Are some of them weaker? Yes, but they still serve purposes, while other classes like the Templar or Sorc or Nightblade have literally useless skills that are only utilized from less knowledge players or players who are trying to have fun instead of being efficient. And in Elder Scrolls or in any MMO, when you look at it at the end of the day, in competitive PvE or PvP, what gets the job done? It's effectiveness. And it's why DKs are so potent. It's because everything they have is effective and it's powerful and it's unique. So this is why I saved Ardent Flame for last, is because you can just see how badass it is, but how hard it is to balance the DK class. It's why ZeniMax can't just magically flip a few cost ability changes, give them some healing here, and do this or that, because they have so much already that if they get too much, they can just roll downhill with it. It's like once they gain momentum, they're not stopping. So it's a really fickle situation in terms of you have to be really careful with, if you give them too much power, they go too ham, but if you give them too little, then they can't utilize it, because a lot of their power is distributed throughout their kit. I'll agree. In terms of like healing, you have to slot a lot of abilities to do a lot of things, but at the same time they have great passives. They have some of the most badass and powerful ultimates in the game, and they're just really well fleshed out. But anyways, the next video will talk about the class as a whole and how it fits into PvE and PvP in terms of meta play, not the fun dinky stuff. I will talk about the fun, like, more like healer builds and stuff like that, but I don't have any praise to really say about them because they're rather lackluster other than the tank and DPS portion of this class. But anyways, thanks again guys for the long wait. I know it's boring, it's brutal, but college life and other real life stuff has me really tied up. I'm also trying to stay relevant in the game. There's so many things to do with one Tamriel. It's been a blast, but it's still very time consuming, so I appreciate the long wait. But I look forward to making more content. I'm hoping to make a Nightblade guide soon. I'm going to put my written guide into a video format. It's going to be very juicy, a lot of details, a lot of hands-on explanation. Hopefully you guys can gain something out of it. And then I'll move on to the Templar class once the Nightblade build is done, and then that will complete the classes, and then I'll slowly start working into other things like weapon lines, armor lines, and pretty much encompassing every skill line. That a lot of them I'll bundle up into one video, so instead of having 20 videos about 3 minutes long, I'll have 3 videos about 10 to 20 minutes long instead. But anyways, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.